The morning haze clung to the earth like a final warning, drifting through the cold air as engines growled awake across a field of steel. Diesel fumes mixed with the smell of wet soil, settling over rows of armored giants waiting in silence for the order to move. In that brief pause before the storm, every man understood that the next few moments could redraw the line between life and memory. Somewhere within that formation, one crew prepared their machine with a ritual precision, born not from fear, but from the knowledge that hesitation cost lives on this front. They had seen how quickly the battlefield could shift, how the distance between hunter and hunted could collapse in seconds. And today, looming beyond the tree line, the enemy waited with weapons designed to outrange and outgun anything America could field. What drives a man to advance into that kind of fire, knowing the math of survival rarely favors him? What gives a crew the resolve to push forward when the wiser choice might be to hold back? As the engines roared and the ground trembled beneath 30 tons of moving armor, the answer to those questions would reveal itself in ways no doctrine had ever predicted. Before the first shot ever crossed the hedgerows of Normandy, the imbalance between American armor and German heavy tanks was already an undeniable truth. The Sherman was fast, reliable, and easy to repair, but it had been designed for a different kind of war, one where mobility mattered more than brute strength. On the Western Front of 1944, however, strength ruled. The Panthers and Tigers that guarded the German lines were built to dominate at long range, turning open fields into killing grounds, where American crews rarely had the luxury of choosing how to fight. American doctrine tried to solve this mismatch with theory. Sherman units were taught to maneuver, to avoid frontal duels, to rely on numbers and artillery support. On paper, it made sense. In the chaos of the bocage, it did not. The hedgerows blocked lines of sight. Roads funneled tanks into predictable kill zones. And every moment spent searching for a flank was a moment when a German gunner could draw a bead on a moving silhouette. Crews quickly learned that doctrine rarely survived contact. They needed something more immediate, more instinctive, something that could bridge the gap between survival and catastrophe. That need shaped the men who would come to define a new way of fighting. Training had taught them the mechanics of their machine, but combat would teach them its soul. Drivers learned to feel the track tension through their boots. Gunners learned to judge a firing solution in the blink of an eye. Loaders memorized the weight of each round and the rhythm of the gun. In a Sherman, survival depended on turning 5 separate tasks into a single act, fast, fluid, and fearless. The first test came near Villers Fossard, where a German Panther lay concealed behind a hedgerow, its gun already pointed toward the field, where American armor approached. Most crews would have hesitated, waiting for artillery or reinforcements. But hesitation in Normandy had already cost too many lives. Instead, the American tank advanced into the engagement, choosing aggression over caution. The opening shot missed, kicking up soil in front of the German position. The Panther returned fire with a scream of high-velocity steel, its round slicing past the advancing Sherman. Each exchange brought the two machines closer, shrinking the range where German armor held the advantage. At less than 400 yards, the American crew executed a sharp maneuver, swinging the hull just enough to expose the gun toward the Panther's flank. The shot that followed tore through the enemy's side armor, erupting in a burst of internal fire and pressure that blew the turret skyward. It was the first of many victories, but more importantly, it was proof that courage, speed, and precision could rewrite the assumptions of armored warfare. That opening clash marked the true beginning of a new approach, one born not from textbooks, but from necessity, shaped by men who refused to let the limitations of their machine define their fate. Momentum on the Western Front shifted not through grand strategies, but through countless small decisions made under fire. For the crew that had learned to trust the instinct over doctrine, this became their greatest weapon. Each engagement refined their method. Move first, shoot fast, close the distance before the enemy could bring its superior guns to bear. What began as a desperate experiment soon became a pattern that others in the division noticed. Near Saint Lo, that pattern turned into something extraordinary. In a landscape crushed by artillery and cut into fragments by hedgerows, the crew faced a mixed German column attempting to regroup. Instead of waiting for infantry to clear the route, they pushed forward, catching half-tracks and tanks clustered along a narrow road. The fight lasted minutes. When the smoke settled, 3 tanks and 15 armored vehicles lay destroyed. It was a brutal example of aggression outpacing preparation, of speed denying the enemy the chance to react. 2 weeks later near Mortain, their resolve was tested again. A pair of Panthers had set an ambush, using elevation and concealment to dominate the approach. Under conventional tactics, the Americans should have pulled back. Instead, they surged forward, forcing the Panthers to fire hastily at a closing target. A slight shift in angle, a brief flash of exposed side armor, and the American gunner found his mark. One Panther erupted, then the other. What should have been a killing ground became another narrow escape. These victories were not luck. They were the result of a crew functioning with near-surgical coordination. The driver anticipated terrain before the commander spoke. The gunner tracked targets even as the tank lurched over broken earth. The loader moved with the rhythm of a machine he understood better than himself. In those moments, the Sherman was no longer a collection of steel plates and rivets. It was a single organism, shaped by shared experience and held together by trust. Word of their methods spread through the 3rd Armored Division. Crews who had watched Sherman's burn in Normandy now looked for ways to replicate the aggressive style they had once considered reckless. Reports from German units noted the change. American tanks pressing forward despite being hit, refusing to retreat, forcing engagements at close range, where the advantages of German armor narrowed. It was an unexpected shift that unsettled veteran panzer crews. By late August, their record had grown into something unprecedented. 12 tanks destroyed, hundreds of armored vehicles knocked out or abandoned, columns shattered before they could form defensive lines, and all of it accomplished in a machine the enemy dismissed as inferior. At the height of their success, the crew was no longer simply surviving battles. They were shaping them. Their actions demonstrated that initiative, bold, immediate, and fearless, could overturn the assumptions of armored warfare. For a brief moment in that turbulent summer of 1944, they showed what was possible when 5 men refused to let the odds decide their fate. As summer gave way to the colder winds of September, the war's pace showed no mercy, even to crews who had survived against impossible odds. After months of continuous combat, the order finally arrived. The crew was to return to the United States for a war bond tour. For the first time since Normandy, the men allowed themselves to imagine a future not shaped by daily risk. It was a fragile hope, but on the Western Front, hope was a rare commodity. Their final mission before rotation was meant to be routine, an advance near the Siegfried Line, with strict instructions that they were not to take the lead. The battalion commander feared losing them so close to safety. But war rarely respects careful planning. Positions that appeared quiet concealed threats waiting for a single mistake. That mistake came in the form of unfamiliar hands. Their regular loader, a man whose timing had become second nature to the crew, had already been sent to the rear for medical checks. In his place stood a young replacement who had never fought alongside them. He knew the procedure, but not the rhythm, not the instinctive flow that held the crew together. On a battlefield where seconds mattered more than armor thickness, that difference proved fatal. As the tank advanced past a damaged house, the commander spotted the outline of an 88 mm gun, one of the most feared weapons in Germany's arsenal. He called the target. The gunner aligned the sights. The order to fire echoed through the turret. And then the round jammed. A single misloaded shell froze the gun at the worst possible moment, leaving the Sherman blind and exposed. The German crew reacted instantly. The flash of the 88 mm muzzle cut through the morning haze, followed by a blast that tore into the turret. The shell passed between two crewmen and detonated inside, ripping steel and flesh with the same indifference. The explosion hurled the commander out of the hatch, shattering his leg and knocking the breath from his lungs as he hit the earth. Inside the tank, fire and smoke swallowed the compartment. The driver and bow gunner were dragged out alive, dazed and burned, but breathing. The gunner was gravely wounded, pinned by shrapnel. The replacement loader, still barely a man, was killed instantly. Medics reached the commander as he tried, through sheer will, to stop the bleeding from what remained of his leg. They gave him morphine, applied tourniquets, and pulled him back from the edge of shock. But no amount of skill could undo what had been lost in that single exchange of fire. In the quiet that followed, the cost of their campaign finally revealed itself. Not in the number of enemy vehicles destroyed, but in the shattered bodies and the empty space where a crewman once stood. Victory had defined their summer. Now consequence defined its end. In the months that followed, analysts within the U.S. Army began to examine what had happened on the Western Front, not just in terms of victories, but in terms of the adaptation that had made those victories possible. The mismatch between the Sherman and German heavy armor was no longer theoretical. It was a daily reality that commanders and crews had been forced to confront. And yet, in that imbalance, new ideas had taken root. What some called recklessness, others recognized as innovation born from necessity. For military planners, the actions of certain Sherman crews highlighted an uncomfortable truth. Doctrine had lagged behind the battlefield. The rigid belief that tanks should avoid close combat with Panthers and Tigers had collapsed under the weight of real engagements. Reports from the 3rd Armored Division showed that initiative, swift, aggressive, and unpredictable, had become the only practical counter to German firepower. Across the front, officers quietly adjusted tactics, encouraging crews to exploit mobility at distances where German optics and long-barreled guns offered less certainty. Historians later noted that these battlefield lessons contributed to the evolution of American armor in the final year of the war. Improvements in the Sherman, combined with the eventual arrival of the M26 Pershing, reflected a growing recognition that American industry needed to produce tanks capable of meeting heavy armor head-on. But those machines came too late for the men who had spent 1944 fighting with what was available, relying on ingenuity more than equipment. From a broader perspective, the story resonated far beyond military analysis. To American audiences, it became an example of how ordinary soldiers had shaped the outcome of the war through determination rather than technological advantage. To German veterans, it demonstrated how even superior machines could be overcome by relentless pressure and unorthodox tactics. And to scholars of armored warfare, it became a case study in how adaptation occurs not through committees, but through the actions of individuals who refuse to accept the limits placed before them. In the end, the legacy left behind was not simply a tally of destroyed vehicles. It was a reminder that doctrine is only a starting point, and that on the battlefield, survival often belongs to those willing to rewrite the rules in real time. When the war finally ended and the guns fell silent, the stories of armored combat faded into the background of a world eager to rebuild. Yet some stories refused to disappear, carried forward by veterans who remembered the men who had fought beside them. Among those memories were accounts of crews who changed the tempo of battle, who stepped into the narrow space between survival and defeat, and proved that resolve could matter as much as steel. For one American crew, the war lasted only 81 days. But the imprint they left on the battlefield stretched far beyond that brief span. What they accomplished was never simply about numbers or tallies. It was about the willingness to confront superior firepower with speed, intuition, and an unbreakable bond among 5 men who understood that each decision they made carried the weight of all their lives. The commander who had led them returned home with scars that reshaped every step he took. Physical wounds were only part of the cost. Like many veterans of armored combat, he carried the quieter burden of memory, the faces of the men he saved and the one he lost, the echo of decisions made in seconds that remained with him for decades. Yet he kept moving forward, working with machines, teaching others, finding purpose in the simple rhythm of everyday life. His legacy was preserved not through speeches or memoirs, but through the crews who adopted his methods, the historians who studied his battles, and the training halls that carried his name. It lived on in the idea that courage in war is rarely loud. More often, it is the silent choice to act when hesitation would be easier. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson left behind. That history is shaped not only by the weapons a nation builds, but by the individuals who refuse to yield when circumstance turns against them. That even in the shadow of more powerful enemies, ingenuity and determination can tip the balance. As we look back on that summer of 1944, we are reminded that the cost of every mile gained was paid in human lives, and that the men who fought those battles deserve more than footnotes. They deserve to be remembered. If this story resonates with you, consider sharing your thoughts below. What lessons do you think modern warfare still carries from those fields in Europe? And if you'd like to continue exploring these hidden chapters of military history, we invite you to join us for the next story.